Well, Penn State lost just about every single priority prospect in this 2026 cycle. There had to be a reason for it, right?
You are Locked On College Crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
That is right. It's a Locked On crossover to talk some Penn State football recruiting. And thank you for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. My name is Zach Sako, and I am your host of Locked On Nittany Lions, credentialed media member for both Penn State football and Penn State wrestling. He is plugged into all football recruiting, our recruiting expert here on the Locked On Podcast Network, Brian Smith. He is the host of The Portal, the show dedicated to all things transfer portal and high school football recruiting related news. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Thank you to the everydayers for making us a part of your regular routine, and friendly reminder to let us know your thoughts down in the comments section as we are talking about what really happened here, because Penn State lost about just every single priority prospect in this 2026 cycle. We're going to get to the bottom of it, also make some commitment flip predictions for the Nittany Lions, and which players are being underrated, the prospects that are actually committed to Penn State, which ones we like, which ones are being severely underrated. We'll wrap up this crossover with just that. Brian, beginning with how Penn State, went 0 for 10, 0 for a dozen on these priority prospect, the headline matchups, if you will, because they didn't lose on everybody. They got Kevin Brown, they got Messiah Mickens, but the ones that were in the spotlight, Joey O'Brien, Khary Adams, Grayson McHugh, all to Notre Dame, Dorian, Barney, Carter Meadows. I can go on and on and on. Luke Wafel. In your mind, what happened here? Because, NIL, roster retention, maybe Notre Dame and Michigan are just the better brand at this point in time. In your mind, generally, how do you see it?
NIL is part of it. Part of it is the guys they recruited against. As I always like to remind people, no matter what show I'm on, recruits pick coaches, not schools. And I know a lot of hardcore fans get really angry when they hear that, but it's true in the South.
It's the truth, yeah.
It doesn't make any difference. So it's just relationship based. Sometimes a kid wants a certain major. There's a lot of little things that can be. But the overall theme here is Penn State's class was already really good. And then it was just kind of weird that stretch happened. Like, if all of those kids had been balanced out from February through the end of June, we wouldn't be talking about it. But they all decided in a short time, and it just made it look worse. I mean, I heard somebody on a pod, had nothing to do with Penn State. Somebody was like, yeah, Penn State really took one on the chin in recruiting this week. And they weren't even talking about Penn State. It was just like a random comment. It's just because so many were all together. So I don't really look at it that way. They didn't change anything with their dynamics. I actually saw a couple of the themes, like what Penn State looks for in recruits and everything. James Franklin was on a podcast talking about body language when they meet with them, questions they ask, like, it's really specific, and it was smart stuff. They don't get fooled very much. I mean, you're gonna miss on some kids, but I mean, James Franklin's smarter than some 17-year-old kid who thinks he's smart, but is he going to really fool a guy that's been through what James has? I doubt that. So sometimes you just lose. I mean, they came in second or third for about 10 players that were very, very good. It just is what it is. This wasn't their year. These things happen on the field too. Sometimes teams can't win a close game to save their life. Then the next year they're 10-2 with 4 games they won by 4 points or less. It just flips around. So NIL is a big part of it, but I think the biggest is still relationships. They just lost to some teams that have really good assistant coaches as recruiters. Like Mickens got the 2 DBs to Notre Dame. He's as good a coach / recruiter at DB as there is in the country.
Yeah.
It is what it is. I get that. So Penn State will have plenty of those battles go their way too. It's just par for the course.
And I think people are looking for this one size fits all reason for, losing that many priority prospects. And like I said, it wasn't everybody. Kevin Brown committed, Messiah Mickens, but that's not the recruiting punch that you land, if you will, because that's the quiet battle that, is taken care of early on. I mean, Mickens and Brown have been committed for such a long time, and this wasn't one that went, and that's the way that Penn State likes it. They don't want these recruiting battles to carry on deep into the summer. They want this to take care of itself very early and then add prospects as they go along and continue to do their due diligence. But you can look at just about every single prospect that either went in Penn State's favor or against them and probably find an individual reason at the end of the day. Grayson McHugh, that seemed like a Notre Dame just won that battle outright. It wasn't about NIL. It wasn't about all of this. One of the top offensive tackles in Pennsylvania. That just went Notre Dame's way. I think the same thing for Joey O'Brien. I don't think that's it. It's NIL. It's completely NIL. Maybe Notre Dame offered him a little more NIL, but Notre Dame's On 3, that portion of their individual On 3 site had a prediction for Joey O'Brien for over a year. So when you look at it individually, there's kind of a reason. Now, some of them definitely NIL related. Luke Wafel to USC. Come on. That is definitely NIL. Peyton Falzone flipping to Auburn. You cover Auburn closely. You and I can see the writing on the wall. There are Carter Meadows to Michigan, all of those. So you can kind of point to each individual case and say NIL related. Hey, they just purely lost here because of relationships, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that really does happen sometimes, like where it catches. The Falzone thing, by the way, that was the most out of left field recruitment in a decade. I got a phone call from Zach Blackerby, and I'm like, what?
Yeah.
We don't miss much. I live 5 minutes from the stadium at Auburn. Like, I know what's going on around here. Nobody knew. So there is still some randomness in recruiting, and maybe the kid didn't want to be in a 2-quarterback class. I don't know. Whatever it is, but there's some randomness to recruiting. But like Joey O'Brien, that kid went back and forth on his decision about 5 times. It could have went a lot of ways. That was a very close recruitment. Notre Dame kind of got lucky in some way. I think they had the last visit for him or something, but that could have went a bunch of different ways. Those are the kinds of things you can't really put a price tag on. Like, well, this is definitely what it is. So I wouldn't worry about that. The one that was interesting to me was Wafel, though.
Yeah.
I mean, you and I both thought he was going to go to Penn State or Ohio State. When I saw USC come up on my screen, I'm like, oh, God, did not see that coming. So I think that's NIL. And not that USC, I mean, that's one of the most tradition-rich programs in college football history, by all means. But Jersey kids usually don't go all the way to Southern California. That's just not the way it goes. And his brother's at Penn State, right? So
yep.
maybe that worked against him. He wants to cut his own cloth, but that's really grasping at straws there. So that one surprised me a bit too. Carter Meadows took the check. I don't think that's any secret. I'm pretty sure he wanted to go to Ohio State from what I heard, but like Michigan didn't want him at Ohio State.
I can understand that.
Yeah, I get it. Those schools like literally loathe one another. So there's a lot of little things like that. So let me ask you, do you think Penn State's NIL has changed that much in the last, say, 6-12 months, or is it pretty much where it was a year ago?
Well, Brian, it's very interesting because as we sit here and have this conversation around football, Penn State hockey just spent allegedly $700,000 for one of the best prospects, generationally speaking. So NIL is not an issue when it really matters. And that's something I really want to get to the bottom here. Drew Aller, it costs a lot of money to keep him going off to the NFL. Katron Allen, Nicholas Singleton, Denai Dennis Sutton, Zachy Wheatley. I can go on and on and on. Penn State also wants to, at least from the football perspective, the donors would rather commit their available donations, their financial investment to veteran players that have shown commitment to Penn State University to high school prospects who haven't done anything. That's the fact of the matter. Objectively speaking, a senior in high school has not done a darn thing for Penn State versus Drew Aller, who's going into his 4th year, Katron Allen, who's going into his 4th year, Denai Dennis Sutton, who's going into his 4th year. They deserve the millions of dollars in comparison to, respectively, a high school prospect that has not played a single down for Penn State football.
I think that's something you and I talked about the last time I was on the show. the three schools that I think do the best job with retention and just kind of like consistency, Clemson, Penn State, Notre Dame, and number them whatever way you want. They're in that same bag. There are other schools too, but they don't overshoot with a bunch of kids coming into their program. They only plug a hole from the portal if it's real. Like Pena, did they go pay Pena? I'm sure they did.
Yeah.
But they needed, like, obviously they needed receiver help. Okay, if other guys in the roster are mad about that, then you know what? You're probably not very good. That's how I would look at it if I was James Franklin. So they used the very smart timing with it. Clemson, same thing. They finally took a couple kids. Notre Dame always plugs some guys to get a quarterback, whatever. But mostly those programs build from within, and it's because guys don't leave because they're not getting jumped. I've had a few of the Clemson commits that I spoke to this year talk about, I knew that the portal wasn't going to be a problem because they won't take guys over me. And I'm like, I bet that's a really big sell for Dabo Swinney. That's the kind of things you have to pick your poison. Do you want to be a developmental program, or do you prefer we're just going to make splashes all over the place? I mean, even Kirby has, they won't say a lot of things publicly because it's such a political deal with recruiting. There are some kids they didn't take or didn't go after as much because of what they were asking, and they wanted them. Kirby wants the talent. Like, nobody recruits harder than Kirby Smart, but because he doesn't want to screw up his locker room and all that, same thing you were just talking about. He's got sophomores, juniors, and seniors too. So it's a really delicate balance, and sometimes you got to let a guy go.
Well, Penn State's class of 2026, if you think it's finished just because they have 25 commitments, well, you are mistaken, as it is now flip season for the Nittany Lions and probably some other programs as well. So which prospects could flip to Penn State? Well, there's one school they're definitely going to go after because there's plenty of mutual prospects that they could push for when the fall rolls around. We'll tell you which school and which names to be aware of. That is all coming up next here on this Locked On Crossover. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. And are you new to FanDuel? Because new customers can bet just $5, and you will get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. That's right, $150 in bonus bets to use on all the sports I just named. Major League Baseball, WNBA basketball, golf, and soccer, as I've mentioned. Also, even in the offseason, Penn State football. That's right. Lines are available for Penn State football. Win totals as well in college football. Do you think the Nittany Lions are going to have more than 10.5 wins or less than 10.5 wins? If you like those lines, you can bet them over at FanDuel.com. And remember, if you are new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and you will get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Well, Penn State lost a quarterback. Could they try to flip a quarterback? That's going to be difficult, but there is one school that Penn State could try to push to land some of these prospects, especially since the three that I'm thinking of are all Pennsylvania natives. Brown, we can go back and forth. You can ask me about a name. I'll ask you about a few names since, you have more of a national perspective here. I think realistically, people are going to ask about Joey O'Brien, Khary Adams, and Grayson McHugh. And I'll be honest, I think Penn State's chances are a little to next to nothing to land those prospects. Notre Dame doesn't routinely have flips or decommitments, and Joey O'Brien and Khary Adams seem to have verbally expressed that they are all in on Notre Dame. That's fine. I think Carter Meadows and Luke Wafel, let's just get those out of the way. I don't think Penn State's going to be able to flip them as well because of contractual agreements. Same thing with Emmanuel Iheanacho over at Oregon. I've seen Messiah Hampton thrown around. But what about Rutgers? Because if Penn State lost a few recruiting battles to the Scarlet Knights this cycle, oddly enough, and I don't think that gets talked about enough. Maybe Penn State didn't push enough in the moment. But if there's a round two here, Elias Koch, wide receiver and teammate of Kevin Brown's at Harrisburg High School. Tavian Branch, I know there was a discrepancy. Is he going to be a D tackle? Is he going to be an offensive lineman? Wants to be a D tackle, clearly, because that's what he's committed as. That's how Rutgers took him for his position. And then and like I said, that's not the only one. YD Collier, 6'5" defensive end. out of the state of Pennsylvania. So if Penn State's going to flip any prospects, I would circle those three as the most realistic if they were to push and start another recruiting battle in the middle of this season.
I could see any of those. And since you're using Pennsylvania as your starting point, for whatever it's worth, I was told that Dorian Barney at one point lived in Pennsylvania, I think Erie.
He did, and I just got confirmation that he was a silent commitment to Penn State at one point, but Michigan was able to have the last laugh.
Well, is it the last laugh or not? That's the thing. Like, Michigan's going to be good. It's a good program, blah, blah, blah. I get it. But if you're James Franklin, it's not like you're going to stop recruiting a really talented player from Carrollton High School that has ties to the Keystone State. That's how I would look at it. So that's another one. But the kids you just mentioned, I don't know those kids very well, but which one do you think is the most likely that Penn State would put the most effort into trying to flip out of the kids with Rutgers?
Well, I think there's somewhat of a domino effect. Let's say these three prospects have a great start to their senior campaigns, and Penn State does need a fourth wide receiver. At least they would like one. I mean, they have three wide receiver prospects, and that's what we're going to talk about, which prospects are underrated and the ones that we like. There are a couple wide receivers that we're definitely going to talk about in the final segment. Elias Koch, it seemed like was a Penn State, and that's what's interesting. Collier, Koch, and Branch all seem like Penn State leans for a little bit of time. And then all of a sudden, Rutgers was able to, again, was it NIL? Maybe Rutgers. I mean, Greg Schiano's not a bad coach. I just don't think his setup is the best. So he is always fighting an uphill battle. But I think you put him at a more credible program, he has an easier time than he would at Rutgers anyway. But Elias Koch, I think, would make the most sense of the three. Tavion Branch, I think there is a slight domino effect, because what if Penn State lands a commitment from Carter Gooden, who is the strong side defensive end / D tackle? At least Penn State's going to start him at defensive end, and the jury's still out if he finishes at D end or D tackle. Tavion Branch is a clear-cut defensive tackle, and I liked watching his film. I don't know what the discrepancy was for Penn State, that they thought he was an offensive lineman, or at least he could have been, and then maybe they move him back over. Rutgers said all the way, you're a DT, which I agree with. I think this guy should be in Penn State's class as a defensive tackle, and the Scarlet Knights capitalized on that. If I have my preference, I would say Tavion Branch. Realistically speaking, I think for Penn State's perspective, Elias Koch.
Well, those are some interesting ones. The big guys in particular, I always pay attention to. One of the reasons Penn State made it to the Final Four last year is they've consistently brought in the big guys year after year after year. But I'm trying to think, when was the last time Rutgers really beat them for a guy in the trenches? Like, not somebody that Penn State offered and then didn't really pursue, but like somebody they were interested in. Like, especially a PA kid?
Yeah.
Did Penn State really go after, like, at any point, or was it just a fleeting kind of deal? Because that shocks me. Like, Franklin knows the importance of getting guys down with the three-point stance. So that surprises me a lot.
Especially when they need defensive tackles.
It's the hardest position by far to recruit right now, because the kids, if you're not paying, you're not getting.
Yeah.
And I mean overpaying. They're for the good ones. I had a conversation with the D-line coach on the trail talking to me about that, because he said there just aren't enough of them. And he's really, really right, because it's not even close. There aren't half as many D tackles at the level college coaches want as there needs to be. Like, literally. It's that hard a position to find the athleticism and the size combined out of high school. So I'm not surprised by that. But do you think that Penn State still needs one more DT, or do you think they would like to get two more?
I think their goal is to get at least one more defensive lineman. So they'll take Carter Gooden. It's down to UCLA or Penn State, and who knows, he might commit relatively soon. I'm not sure. He's one of the top prospects. He is the top prospect in the state of Massachusetts. I personally would like to see Tavion Branch flip from Rutgers to Penn State, just because I did like his film. I liked his film generally a lot. If there's anybody else that should be on Penn State's radar, anybody that thinks there's a chance that Penn State's going to go after and get a second quarterback, that's why the Peyton Falzone flip is such a big deal, because now it just puts Penn State at a long-term disadvantage. Your quarterback room becomes a bigger question mark after Drew Aller leaves. Ethan Grunkemeyer, Jackson Smolik, that's great that you have two guys that could be the starter in due time in a year from now. But then it's just Troy Hune. You're banking on that Beckham Kritza continues to get better. And that's where Falzone kind of came in, is it just gave you an extra piece to leverage your quarterback room long-term. Because if he breaks out, okay, you have some insurance, reassurance type of thing. Gavin Sidwar's committed to Missouri. He's the quarterback. That's the thing. You got to convince somebody that is a genuinely a decent quarterback by some metric as a high-end 3-star or a 4-star and say, come be the second QB in our class behind Troy Hune. That's almost disrespectful in a way. So Penn State, I think they should focus on wide receiver and defensive line because they have 6 defensive backs. They have 5 offensive linemen. They have 3 linebackers. They're pretty set at most positions.
Yeah, I would say so. It's just now they got to be picky. My expectation is there's somebody that we don't know about right now that will either A, have a really good fall, or it's somebody they're already talking to behind the scenes that's not known. It could be a kid that's from Tennessee or Texas or anywhere that they flipped from somebody else that doesn't have a good season, but they'll get somebody. Everybody flips a good player during fall. That's just the nature of it. Penn State might have a kid they lose as well, but my guess is they'll gain at least one. If they get 2, it would not surprise me.
And prospects that are unknown. Well, there are uncommitted players that aren't being talked about. There are committed players that aren't being talked about enough. So we're going to take a deep dive into Penn State's current class of 2026 with 25 players committed. The ones that we like, the ones that aren't generating enough buzz because people just don't know about them. We're going to tell you the prospects that will surprise in due time once they show up on Penn State's campus. That is coming up next here on this Locked On Crossover. Brian, I think this is a pretty easy conversation because Penn State's class, one of the reasons it gets criticized or it gets dunked on is because there are too many 3-stars. Why is a place like Penn State taking a bunch of 3-stars? This happens a lot, actually. I think because it's so recent that this conversation happens over and over again. There's a lot of underrated prospects here. Alex Haskell's not a 3-star. Jasir Rogers is not a 3-star. Terry Wiggins is an underrated 4-star. At least he's just over the threshold to be a 4-star. And Kevin Brown, you saw him in person recently. He is a 5-star. At least he plays like it. So there are plenty of those prospects that I would initially start with as players that are just going to perform above expectation. Kevin Brown's not just a high-end 4-star. He is a 5-star and a top 30 player nationally once the rankings catch up in this class of 2026. Jasir Rogers, the only reason he's a 3-star on 3 has him as a 4-star, so I'm glad he has the respect there, but it's because he plays in Delaware against weaker competition. That's okay to say. He just doesn't play the best competition. But Penn State took him because he still showed that same talent against comparable competition at showcases, at these 7-on-7s, at these Penn State summer camps. That's why you take these commitments. So forget what the rankings say collectively. Penn State makes these judgments for a reason, and they ignore the rankings for a good reason, because if they were going off of them, Jasir Rogers would be at another school.
I agree with that. I really like Rogers' film. He's one of the better slot receivers in this class, and I think he'll be a good return man for the Nittany Lions as well. The 2 guys that I'm most curious about in their class, because I spoke about this earlier on the podcast, and I'm probably going to butcher the name, Roseby Lubinis and then Marlon Bright, because they're tackles.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they'll both end up at tackle. Those things take care of themselves. But if Penn State keeps developing offensive linemen, like the group they have this fall, conservatively is a top 10 group, probably conservatively top 5.
Top 10. Yeah, I was going to say conservatively top 5. I could make the argument right now that this group for this season is number 1. They have a case.
Yeah, I think there's a really good chance of that. But they didn't all come in as 4- and 5-star guys, and they didn't all just develop overnight either. It is a process. And you can take kids like this who may not be ready right away because you recruit consistently, and that way 18, 19-year-olds aren't forced to start in the big house or at Iowa, et cetera, as freshmen. That is how you win football games. So while they won't be the guys that play next season in 26, it's not realistic. In 27, maybe. In 2028, you're going like, oh, yeah, I remember Marlon Bright. Now he's your left tackle or whatever as a junior. That's how you win football games long term. That's how you compete for a Big Ten title, is continually bringing in big guys and bring them along. And whoever wins is whoever wins. So I think that's probably something we should talk about. And I also think that overall, the athleticism they got on defense is also very standardized to what they've done the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
Even some of the guys that have turned out really good and wore number 11 at Penn State, they didn't all come in as 5 stars. Some of the guys at Penn State in the last 5-6 years, whether they were 11 or not, they were three-star kids. There's a certain defensive tackle from Orlando that not that many people really went after. I knew about him. I talked about him all the time because he played 7-on-7 as a tight end. There's a lot of different kids like that, and Penn State finds them. So I love their edge players, and I think their offensive tackles are probably a little bit better than what they're rated.
No, I'm glad that you bring up Roseby Labentis and Marlon Bright. Marlon Bright certainly has the measurables, and what I've seen on his film, if he stays committed to the process, could end up being Penn State's starting left or right tackle at the end of the day. I think there's a case for Labentis to move into guard because I don't know it. Now, again, never say never. His athleticism could eventually catch up, but you can't teach 6'6", 350 pounds as a senior in high school. He should probably lose some of that weight if he intends to play tackle, but you can't teach the measurables that somebody like Labentis has. Let me mention another player that's in Delaware who's going to be a defensive tackle, Isaac Chukara. Chukara didn't even have a recruiting profile when he committed to Penn State, and then the industry had to go. They had to catch up, and then some people were complaining that, oh, why are they taking a commitment from him? Again, that's not by accident. He goes out to a regional camp, Brian, for the All-22, the skilled position equivalent to Elite 11.
Elite 11, yeah, I know what it is.
And wins MVP, wins defensive MVP at the State College Pennsylvania Regional. So that tells me everything that I need to know about, again, Penn State's not going off of the rankings. They know what they're doing.
Yeah, I'll take the in-person evaluation every time.
Yeah.
It's a lot different. Like some of my friends that don't get out to all the stuff always say, you don't have to go in. It's different. Plus, you get to meet the kids, see the personality, see how they work with other kids. If they shine, do they handle it well? There's so many things with in-person evaluations that are just so critical to the process. Penn State's done a good job. Look, again, they have a very high retention rate. Why is that? Because people that go there tend to fit. That's something Franklin talks about all the time. And he's right. If you don't get the right kids, it doesn't matter what their star ranking is. Matter of fact, it probably doesn't matter that much anyway. But they have to be able to fit in Happy Valley. So I'm good with it.
And that is where we will wrap up this Locked On crossover. Again, I could go through this class of 2026 and make the case for why there is a prospect that's slightly underrated for whatever reason. Because I think it is a disservice. A Benjamin Azuka, the guard that's committed here, I think he is underrated. I mentioned an Alex Haskell, another player that's underrated. There's the DBs, the 6 defensive backs that Penn State took, and Amari Polidor. All of these players will see a boost in the rankings in due time. But we could have an entire podcast devoted to, hey, why is this prospect underrated? And maybe we do have a future conversation like that. But that is where we'll end things here. He is Brian Smith, recruiting expert for the Locked On Podcast Network. My name is Zach Sako, the host of Locked On Nittany Lions, and thank you for checking out this crossover episode. Please leave a like, share it with friends and family. Let us know your thoughts down in the comments section, and become an everydayer if you're not one already. Subscribe to our YouTube channels and wherever you get your podcasts for the latest around Penn State sports and all things recruiting with Locked On Nittany Lions and the Portal.